Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, of which I'm a proud member, and professor of law at George Washington University. He studied English literature and government at Harvard University, and after graduating, was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, in Balliol College in Oxford, studying philosophy, politics, and economics. He attended Yale Law School, where he served as senior editor of the Yale Law Journal. He clerked after graduation for Chief Judge Abner Mikva of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Since then, he's had a stellar career as a legal journalist, writing for such publications and working for such publications as the New Republic, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and just this morning was on NPR talking about executive power. His books are numerous and varied. Titles such as The Naked Crowd, Reclaiming Security and Freedom in an Anxious Age, The Most Democratic Branch, How the Courts Serve America, The Supreme Court, The Personalities and Rivalries That Define America, The Unwanted Gaze, The Destruction of Privacy in America. This is for you, Mr. Angel.
I'm a very private person.
This man does not have an easy pass. Like, it's just too invasive. And a biography of his favorite president, William Howard Taft.
My favorite Chief Justice, I would say.
He's been called the nation's most widely read and influential legal commentator. Now, all that is fine and well and good and impressive. But what I really care about is a podcast. It's called We the People. It's a weekly program of constitutional debate hosted by Professor Rosen at the National Constitution Center. It is a program in which the finest legal minds in our country come together to debate crucial, important issues from often deeply opposed positions. And Professor Rosen moderates these discussions with an astonishing even-handedness and clarity and generosity. If somebody tells you that there's no place in this country for reasoned, civil, perceptive debate about important issues, they're not listening to We the People. This is an extraordinary resource for our country, and it's not, well, I could go on. As somebody who's not well versed in constitutional law myself, or the Supreme Court, I find it riveting, full of intellectual drama and significance. Well, while many of us during the pandemic were getting to know our pets better and learning to mix a good Negroni, Professor Rosen was reading deeply in the seminal ancient texts that inspired the founders. Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, Xenophon's Memorabilia of Socrates, the Maxims of Pythagoras, and the Bhagavad Gita. His new book distills some of the key and most relevant lessons for us today. I shouldn't do this, but I want to read one of the sonnets that he puts before his chapters that distill the essence of what he's learning, taking away from these works. This one is about Seneca's On Anger. It's a work that you may have come across. America this morning burns with rage. Red sun at dawn ablaze. The great divide. As victims protest wrong with hot rampage, can righteous anger now be justified? Anger, to punish suffering, desires injustice, or felt injury's recompense. But in its furious haste and vengeful fires, it comes at wrathful punishers' expense. Injustice anywhere roils all our fate. We're bound in mutuality of light. Condemn all wrong with force, but not with hate. Self-mastered calm will gird us for the fight. From Socrates to Dr. King, the way past hate is pure compassion. Agape. Welcome, Professor Rosen.
Thank you so much. A marvelous introduction. I'm so glad you find We the People meaningful. And that sonnet was written after the Lafayette Square riots. And meaningful to think about Seneca on anger in these anxious times as well. I'm so honored to be here at Dickinson and to join you in making a case for the value of the humanities and teaching us how to live in these anxious times. It's so important to go back to these classic texts and to rediscover how the founders of America sought to live a good life and to master their unreasonable passions and emotions so they could achieve the calm tranquility that for them defined virtue and happiness. I want to tell you how I started this improbable reading project during COVID that led me to rediscover the ancient wisdom. I never expected to be getting up early and writing sonnets as opposed to checking out my pets. And I still can't quite believe I did it, but it was a series of unexpected synchronicities that led me to resurrect the ancient wisdom, and here's what happened. I noticed that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had drafted lists of 12 or 13 virtues for daily living, and both chose as their motto for their projects a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. You may know Franklin's project. It's in his autobiography where he says that when he was in his 20s, he resolved to achieve moral perfection. And he made a list of 12 virtues that he later expanded to 13. And they included temperance and prudence and order and cleanliness. He saved the one he found hardest for last, which was humility. And imagining the book, Humility by Benjamin Franklin. So he made a graph, and on the x-axis were the days of the week, and on the y-axis were the virtues. And every week he resolved to focus on a different virtue, to do a self-accounting at night, and to put an X mark in the box if he'd fallen short of the virtue. Tried this for a while. He found it was incredibly depressing. So many X marks, and he gave it up before too long, but he felt he was a better person for having tried. I knew about the project because a friend and I had tried it at the recommendation of a rabbi in Washington, D.C. 10 years ago. Not knowing that it came from Franklin, a Hasidic rabbi in 1808 translated the Franklin virtues into Hebrew and offered them up for Jewish seekers in a form called Musar, or character improvement. This rabbi suggested that my friend and I try it. We tried it for a while. We found it's incredibly depressing. We also gave it up after a couple weeks, but we thought we were improved for having tried it. What struck me during COVID was that Franklin chose as the motto for his project a line from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations that said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the beautiful UVA campus. And on the wall of the hotel was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. And they looked a lot like Franklin's. They included silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. And resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Jefferson left one of Franklin's virtues off his list, maybe he didn't want to raise it, and that was chastity. No chastity on Jefferson. But what really struck me, in addition to the similarity of the lists, was the fact that when Jefferson was asked the secret of happiness, he would send a passage from the Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations. And he would send this to anyone who asked him how to be happy when he was old. And it said, essentially, he who's achieved tranquility of soul, who is neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the self-mastered man of whom we're in quest, he's the happy man. So I thought, basically, I've got to read the Cicero book because it was so important to both Franklin and Jefferson in their definition of happiness as the pursuit not of pleasure but of virtue, not of feeling good but of being good. But what else to read? Then I found this amazing reading list that Jefferson would send to anyone who asked him how to be educated. And he would send this to kids who were going to law school and his adult friends who were lifelong learners who were seeking to educate themselves. And what just struck me was both the breadth of the books on the list and the rigor of the schedule that Jefferson prescribed for reading them. The breadth was incredible. It includes novels and poetry and astronomy and science and physics. But what really caught my eye was the section on moral philosophy, and sometimes Jefferson called it natural religion or ethics. And at the top of that list was the Tusculan Disputations by Cicero, and then Cicero's On Duties, and then Seneca's essays, and Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and Epictetus, as well as some Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Hutcheson and Bolingbroke and Hume. And what struck me about these books is that I had not read almost all of them. And as you heard, I've had the privilege of this marvelous liberal arts education. And I am so grateful every day to my spectacular teachers of English literature and philosophy and history and politics and law in high school and college and law school. And I find myself on a daily basis giving gratitude to these teachers for having introduced me to a life of reading and growing. But despite all of this wonderful learning that I had, I just never encountered these moral philosophy books because they'd fallen out of the curriculum by the time I was in college in the 80s. And I remember in the 80s yearning for this kind of guidance about how to lead a good life. It was the Greed is Good decade, Tom Wolfe and You Do You, and celebrating hedonism and materialism and sex and drugs and rock and roll. And I was looking for an alternative to that, those values that were being celebrated by pop culture. And wondering how to lead a good life by reason and reflection rather than simple religious authority or blind faith. I was studying the Puritans with some wonderful scholars of Puritanism like Sackman Berkovich. And I was unconvinced by the rigors of Puritan theology, which essentially say that no amount of good works can guarantee your salvation, not even blind faith, only randomly given grace. This wasn't doing it to me, for me, well, first because I'm Jewish. and also because the theological hair splitting about the impossibility of achieving salvation, even by good works, I found not convincing, as many since me and before me have found. So I craved an answer to that question: can you lead a good life by reason and reflection? And what I didn't realize, because these marvelous books had fallen out of the curriculum, is this is exactly the question that the classical philosophers set out to answer. So I was inspired by the fact that I hadn't read the books and thought I should, but then I was also just daunted and inspired by Jefferson's schedule. Here's what he does not suggest, but sternly recommends. You've got to get up every morning before dawn, read moral philosophy and physics until sunrise, watch the sunrise, read political philosophy, especially Locke and Sidney, until lunch, then history, then astronomy and other science, then dinner, then you're allowed some Shakespeare and light poetry for mild entertainment, and then to bed 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. So now you'll understand. I'm not that weird that I would have done this without just being sort of inspired into it, but I decided to follow the Jefferson schedule. We all had more time, and I thought, what the heck? So I spent a year doing this. I got up every morning before dawn. I read the moral philosophy. I watched the sunrise. And I wrote those sonnets, which I know seems incredibly weird. But then it turned out that all sorts of people in the founding era wrote sonnets after reading this moral philosophy, including Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet, the great Phyllis Wheatley with her Sonnets of Virtue. Hamilton wrote some sonnets, Mercy Otis Warren, and John Quincy Adams, one of the absolute heroes of the whole story, would wake up in the White House, read Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, his favorite book, write excellent sonnets, and then walk along the Potomac. So there's something in this beautiful literature. It's the harmony and the rationality of it that craves to be summarized in simple form. Anyway, that's what I did. So I spent a year doing this, and it changed my life. It changed what I thought about how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen, and also my understanding of the pursuit of happiness. And I want to tell you now about how it changed my sense of how to be a good person, and tomorrow we can talk about how it changed my sense of how to be a good citizen. What I learned from reading the classical moral philosophy came to me as a revelation. First, as I said, for the founders and for the ancients, happiness meant not feeling good, not being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. But what I also learned is that for the ancients, virtue meant self-improvement, character improvement, mastering your unreasonable passions and emotions so you can achieve the calm, temperance, prudence, courage, and justice that define the classical virtues and that define well-being. Today, we would think of it as a form of impulse control, summed up in the famous Stanford marshmallow test from the 70s. Kids who were really young, 5 years old, are given a choice between one marshmallow now and 2 marshmallows if they can wait for 15 minutes. And the experiment suggested that the kids who could wait for 15 minutes just did much better later in life. They did better in school and better in their personal interactions and in their jobs because of their impulse control. And that basic definition pervades the literature. It's in the ancient moral philosophy, it's in the revolutionary classical Whig and classical Republican literature, it's in Blackstone, of course it's in the Old and New Testaments. It's resisting your immediate gratification so that you can serve your long-term interest. But it also was deeply rooted in classical moral psychology. And in this sense, I learned so much of it goes back to Pythagoras, who knew that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, as if that weren't enough, he was also a guru who lived on the Isle of Croton like a great inspirational figure and inspired his disciples first to be good and then to live like gods. And the way to live like a god was to achieve complete self-mastery of body, spirit, and soul. Pythagoras was a rigorous vegetarian. Ovid's wonderful Book 15 of the Metamorphosis describes Pythagoras' vegetarianism and his extraordinarily stern injunction on eating beans. It's just, you must not eat beans. And it's so serious that once his disciples are being chased by the enemy, and the enemy is about to overcome them, and says, I'll spare your life if you just do me one favor. Tell me, why won't you eat beans? And the Pythagorean soldier says, I'd rather die than tell you the secret, and bites off his tongue and spits out and perishes on the bean field rather than touching beans. Why on earth wouldn't they eat beans? Well, the authorities dispute this, but according to Pliny, it may have been that beans resemble fetuses, so they have the spirit of life in them. Others suggested that beans expel spirits through other orifices. So this was debated, but it seems one or the other that animated this injunction. But the vegetarianism is only a sign for the self-mastery that led Pythagoras to propose the daily habit of self-examination that Franklin popularized in his 13 Virtues. Pythagoras recommended that each evening we should make a self-accounting of how we've fared in achieving the virtues of the soul, of temperance and prudence and moderation in eating and drinking and spirit. And it was this that led to Pythagoras' crucial distinction between reason, passion, and desire. Pythagoras locates reason in the head, reason logos, passion in the heart, pathos, and desire in the stomach, and suggests that we have to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and emotions and desires so we can achieve the calm, tranquility, and moderation that defines virtue and happiness. He's not suggesting that we should lack passion or emotion, but only that we should moderate it. Plato has this famous metaphor of the charioteer, which popularizes the Pythagorean divisions, and imagines the charioteer representing reason and two horses. One is noble and the other is appetitive or desirous, and the goal of the charioteer is to ensure that both horses are pulling in the same direction. And that is why moderation is crucial to the whole moral psychology. Of course, Aristotle sums all this up in the Nicomachean Ethics, which has the famous definition of happiness. Eudaimonia, good demon or good spirit, is defined as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. Because excellence and virtue are not self-defining. I never understood what that meant before realizing that virtue is really a quest for psychological temperance or moderation of the spirit. And that's why the chart at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics about how to achieve the golden mean in all of our emotions is the how-to manual. For each passion or emotion, Aristotle says there's an excess or a deficiency. So we seek to be not rash or insensible, but moderate and temperate. And he suggests in every case we're seeking the golden mean. It's unintuitive, but utterly crucial to realize that for the ancients, moderation is not some form of languor or insensibility, but the opposite. It requires rigorous self-mastery so that we can resist our unproductive passions and emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, and the unproductive goals that they lead to, like ambition and avarice, which lead to ruin, so that we can achieve that calm self-mastery that allows us to subjugate our ego-based emotions and be our best self and serve others. On this guy's moderation, far from being a form of compromise, is the highest form of discipline and the highest form of virtue. And when you realize that the goal of life is to achieve that focused moderation, that calm tranquility at every moment that allows you to tune in, to focus on others rather than your own ego-based fears, and to achieve your potential, it transforms the way you live, because you must use every moment of the day productively, not distracted by the perturbations of the mind, as Cicero put it, so that you can fulfill not only your rights, but your duties to achieve self-perfection. It's an extremely high injunction, and that's why Franklin says in his humility virtue, be as perfect as Jesus and Socrates. Or Pythagoras is another model. You really first be good, then be like gods. Reverence thyself. Each of us has the capacity every day through our individual efforts to try to achieve a form of self-perfection by mastering our souls. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I had the honor of collecting our conversations into a book, told me that her mom gave her a version of this advice. She said, avoid unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will distract you from productive work. And Justice Ginsburg was the most focused and tuned in and self-disciplined person I ever had the privilege of meeting, and she was determined to use each moment of the day for her productive work, or she was also totally tuned in on her family, her clerks, her friends, during the times that she set aside for them. She governed her time with extraordinary rigor, and as a result, she changed the world. She really led that Pythagorean lifestyle in a very inspiring way. The book sets out to tell the stories of the founders, and after doing this reading during COVID, I asked the obvious question, how did they do in applying these virtues in their own lives? They said that virtue and self-mastery was the key to happiness. Did they live up to the ideals or not? And what so struck me is that although all of them fell short of the ideals on a daily basis, in ways large and small, most notably their extraordinary, some of the enslavers' hypocrisy on slavery, which I'll talk about in just a bit, They thought constantly about their efforts to achieve self-perfection. They wrote about it in their diaries. They discussed it with their friends. They chastised themselves for wasting time. They kept rigorous daily schedules. That schedule that Jefferson sent to the kids who were going to law school was one that he essentially was following until the end of his days, when as an old man, he and John Adams are writing, spending hours a day answering their correspondence and engaged in deep reading and trading recommendations about books. Although they fell short on so many levels, the one virtue that most of them continued to practice, which was a result of their youthful habits, was industry, and they kept, until the end, their extraordinary productivity, focus, and deep reading and writing. The book begins with Franklin, and it's so striking that out of all of his achievements, Franklin is the most famous man in the world next to Voltaire, who he famously meets and embraces. And he's tamed the Gulf Stream and summoned the lightning from the heavens. What's the achievement that he owes his success to at the end of his life? He says it's his temperance. It's his moderate temper that led him to maintain his productivity and achieve whatever he was able to achieve. Isn't that remarkable? He said that he learned never to be too tendentious or assertive in matters of opinion or politics. Not to say, I think it's this way or my way or the highway, but instead it may be so, or perhaps, or it occurs to me. And that tentative, moderating spirit allowed him to be the broker at the Constitutional Convention and bring both sides together and ensure near unanimity by saying the document wasn't perfect, but it was as near to perfection as mortals were likely to achieve, as well as, and he thought that temperance was more important than all of his other scientific achievements. He, of course, wanted to start a united society for the promotion of virtue, which would unite people from different backgrounds across the world to gather in local reading groups. And he had a club that he called the Junto, which means to join, which would bring together young men to do daily reading. He got this from John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, which was the source of the motto, and to do self-accounting and improve themselves through virtue. I saw the Locke book and found that that's the one that contains the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. It's just remarkable that people have assumed that when Jefferson said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness rather than life, liberty, and property, he was using property as a synonym for happiness. But that's not the case. Life, liberty, and property appears in Locke's two treatises on government and calls life, liberty, and property natural rights. The essay concerning human understanding is the one that identifies the pursuit of happiness, a phrase Locke uses, as self-mastery or virtue, and calls it an unalienable right. So now I can understand why Jefferson is not using property as a substitute for happiness. Property is alienable. You surrender or alienate it to government when you form societies in order to protect it and get the benefit from its exchange. Happiness is unalienable because it's based in reason. And you can't alienate or surrender your reason to someone else. I can't give you the power to control my thoughts or opinions. I can't totally control them myself, although I can check them. I can restrain them. But the initial thoughts are the result of sense impressions from the external world, and I can't give anyone the power to control that because I can't surrender my reason. So that is all in Locke's essay concerning human understanding, and Samuel Johnson's dictionary, the 1755 dictionary, has two definitions of the pursuit of happiness. One is from the Old English definition, hap, or chance, and the second is the rational mastery of passion or desire. And his citation is to book 51 of Locke's essay concerning human understanding, which uses the phrase the pursuit of happiness. It's there hiding in plain sight. And one of the exciting things about doing research today is all this stuff is online. And it just blows my mind that I could do all this reading sitting on my couch at home, because it's just right there. And through word searches, you just put in the pursuit of happiness, and it's everywhere. This isn't some secret meaning that's, lurking in the shadows. It's in all of the sources. They all use the phrase. They all define it in terms of self-mastery. And this is just the common understanding. at the time. So that's Franklin. Let's talk now about John and Abigail Adams. When they met and began one of the great intellectual and romantic and spiritual marriages of American history, what did they decide to do? Make a list of each other's faults. And they got this, believe it or not, from Pythagoras. They've been reading Pythagoras' golden verses, just like Franklin had, and he recommends that each night before sleeping you have to make a list of each other's faults. It's not a good dating strategy, as they clearly found, because Abigail, in listening to John's faults, remember this is the most haughty and arrogant and obnoxious and disliked guy of his age. You know that from the musical 1776, I'm obnoxious and disliked, that cannot be denied. But she doesn't want to put it quite that bluntly, so she says, well, you're so brilliant that some people might find you a little intellectually intimidating. And he says, well, you're not practicing the piano enough, and you're not reading enough, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she says, well, I'll try to practice more and read more, but a gentleman should not comment on a lady's posture. So they get past that, and then they get married, and they go on to have this just beautiful, they're soulmates, and they trade ideas and books, and they raise their kids together, and Adams eventually works to subjugate his passions. He's mocked in his time. He wants the presidency to be called his elective majesty, so people call him his rotundity. And he's constantly raging that he's not getting enough credit for the revolution. He's just like, will rip off his wig and stomp on the floor and say the Grand Franklin is getting all the credit, or people think Jefferson wrote the Declaration, but it was Adams who actually did the work in committee. He speaks of himself in the third person. And he's like, I should get the credit. But in the end, he's so relatable because he wears his heart on his sleeve, and he's self-aware too, unlike Jefferson, who has remarkable capacity for self-deception. Adams has these huge breakups with friends, and then he reconciles. And the reconciliation with Jefferson is extraordinarily moving. They fight the revolution together. They break up in the election of 1800, the most contested in American history. It's important to realize that in 1800, when the government was up and running, we nearly fell apart based on civil war, because the two political parties created by Adams and Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison almost came to blows. There's the disputed election with Aaron Burr. Hamilton sides with Burr, and Burr kills Hamilton, and Jefferson and Adams don't talk for 10 years, but then they reconcile. And who brings them back together? Benjamin Rush, the great founder of Dickinson. He owes him so much, including this great college, and the fact that he invented psychiatry to a large degree. And he and Adams would trade accounts of each other's dreams and would analyze each other's dreams with great precision and sophistication, which was the foundation of psychiatry in America. My dad was a psychiatrist and hypnotherapist and was a huge admirer of Rush. And I later saw that one of the dreams that Adams and Rush were analyzing was Adams kept having these dreams or nightmares about Hercules' choice between virtue and vice. It was a print that he found in a 1712 book, and it showed Hercules reclining on his club and with vice wantonly beckoning to him with all of her voluptuous charms, and then virtue pointing rigorously toward the mountain of purity. And Adams wakes up in a cold sweat and dreamt that he had chose vice, and then he proposes that it be the seal of the United States. That's his proposal. And he describes the whole thing to Rush, and then he says, this is too complicated, it's not original, basically. Too much to put this on the money. But Rush, analyzes the dream for Adams, and it's so inspiring that I got the print, and I have it in my room at home, and whenever I'm slacking or not doing my morning reading or, being indolent, I think of Adams and try to get back to work. But Rush brings Adams and Jefferson back together. And what did they want to do after they'd reconciled, after the biggest breakup in American history? Talk about books. And it's so moving to see these old men, with all they've achieved, eagerly sharing updates about the latest book they've read. And they really want to talk about comparative spirituality and their own life quests for the pursuit of happiness and spiritual self-mastery. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras may have traveled to the east and read the Hindu Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita. But he's not sure that Joseph Priestley, who's writing a comparison on what he calls the Hindus and the Christians, lived long enough to complete the book. And Jefferson says, good news, he lived. I'll send you the book. I have it in Philadelphia. And Adams is so excited because he thinks that this will show the essential consonance of the wisdom traditions of the East and the West. Just as the Bhagavad Gita says, renounce and enjoy, in a phrase that Gandhi loved to quote, renounce attachment to external results and enjoy eternal bliss. So the Stoic dichotomy of control said, renounce efforts to control the thoughts or actions of others, focus on the only thing you can control, which is your own thoughts and emotions. And then the Dhammapada says, we are what we think, life is shaped by the mind. And Paracelsus says, as we imagine ourselves to be, so shall we be. And Adams, with his remarkable and deep eclectic reading, understands that this focus on the light within, on the divine spark within all of us that can be achieved through rigorous self-mastery is common to the East and the West. And that's why he says that his mature creed, his spiritual creed, he sums up in what he calls the hymn of Cleonth, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. It's just superb. And then Jefferson says that after a life of reflection, he's concluded that he's no longer a Stoic, but an Epicurean. You might laugh, but Jefferson says that is a libel on Epicurus by the Stoics to say that he's a hedonist. The Epicureans are not wanton hedonists. They recommend the rational contraction of desire so that we can rationally meet them. They don't forswear all pleasure like the Stoics unrealistically try to do, but ensure that we have rational and thoughtful pleasures. This is why the Epicurean ideal is moderate elation or rational joy. And there's this amazing moment when the Constitution passes, it's ratified in 1788. The citizens of Philadelphia all dress up in classical garb, holding their pillars and their paeans and their apopanaxoloia. And what do? They line the streets in silence, embodying the principle of rational joy. Can you imagine next Tuesday our citizens going to the polls and just calmly embodying the principle of rational self-mastery? You see how far we've fallen from the classical ideal. But that's how seriously these ideals were taken at the time of the founding, and that's why Jefferson says that he, at the end of his life, is an Epicurean. That leads me to the question of Jefferson and slavery. How is it possible that this man, who ever since he was 14 years old and first copied out the passages from Cicero on grief, the Tusculans, in his diary to console himself when his dad died, who thought so constantly on a daily basis about efforts to achieve the virtues of industry and frugality and self-mastery, could have been so flamboyantly hypocritical when it came to slavery. And the question is that he didn't even try to justify his conduct. I came across a really striking passage from Patrick Henry, who'd just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And he's quoted Cato's letters. And then he says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it, I will not attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And that's what it was. They knew, while indeed they knew it was wicked and immoral, and it violated the Bible and natural law, but they liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up, because it was inconvenient to give it up. And that brutal moment of candor that Henry had was, in their better moments, shared by the enslavers of that generation who did not attempt to justify slavery as being a positive good, as Calhoun and the antebellum enslavers did. But Jefferson was notoriously self-deceiving and hypocritical even by the standards of the enslavers, because far from checking his own avarice or greed, he lived at Monticello like a Caligulan emperor. He imagined himself as the benign head of a kind of Greek agora, but in fact filled the place with French furniture and luxuries, and his entire lifestyle was possible only because he was surrounded by enslaved people, and the people in his house were his own kids. The ones who were actually serving him in his home were his children by Sally Hemings, and she came back from Paris only on the condition that he agreed to free their children on his death. He did keep that promise. He freed 7 people on his death. 2 were his own children, 2 he had already allowed to escape. The rest were Hemings' relatives. None of the rest of the enslaved population was freed, and parents were separated from children, and the entire estate and the human souls in it had to be sold to pay his crushing debts. And it's a remarkable, irony is too weak a word, it's a disgrace that this man, who made the avoidance of debt the centerpiece of his political and personal philosophy, ended up imposing all of his debts on his kids and including his enslaved kids. And Jefferson says that there has to be a constitutional convention every 19 years because the earth is held in usufruct for the living, and we can't impose either the political views or the debts of one generation on another. And that's why he thinks that all debt should actually expire every 19 years as well. And yet, he's just so addicted to the lifestyle and the comforts that it all ends in ashes. It's a sad reality for Jefferson. And unlike, and I want to talk more about him tomorrow because I have the pleasure of learning about him, John Dickinson, who he was the first of the founders to free his entire enslaved population, introduces a bill of Delaware to end slavery. I think the year this college was founded, and it was a model for abolitionism, like others. Franklin grew on the subject, Hamilton, of course, but Jefferson did not. And the other thing is that Jefferson's racism was shocking even by the standards of his day. And it was very jarring to learn about his reaction to the great Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet in America. She comes over to America enslaved. As a teenager, her master and mistress, for some reason, allow her to be educated along with their kids. And after studying the classics for a year, she starts to write poems of virtue, denouncing slavery and praising of the classical virtues, and they're so inspiring that they're praised by George Washington and they're acclaimed by Americans. They're so good that the city of Boston decides to hold a trial about whether or not she wrote her own poems. And in this remarkable, kind of appalling, murder board, or whatever you want to call it, is presided over by John Hancock, the guy who signed the Declaration in big letters, and Cotton Mather and all the Boston literary worthies hold a classical orals exam for Phyllis Wheatley. And Professor Henry Louis Gates, in his book, The Trials of Phyllis Wheatley, imagines questions like, who was Apollo? And name the 9 muses. And she passes with flying colors, and they gravely and pompously certify that she did in fact write her own poems. And then she goes on to become what Professor Gates calls the Oprah Winfrey of her time. She's an international celebrity. She totally rocks the house, and she goes to London, and she's given the keys to the city and meets the Duke and Duchess, and is acclaimed by Franklin over there, and everyone acclaims her genius, except for Jefferson. And in a shocking passage in the notes on the state of Virginia, he has a whole chapter on the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, which he says is beneath contempt because she's black and black people are intellectually inferior. And then he says, I venture this is a suspicion only. He wants to be proved wrong. But then he says that Terence, the great Roman enslaved poet, was white, and white enslaved people can write good poetry. It's just completely appalling and virulent, even by the standards of its day. So it's a disappointing reality that the great prophet of liberty and freedom of conscience, whose pay-ins to freedom of conscience remain among the most inspiring expressions of that great right in all the world, was a virulent racist and a hypocrite. Contrast Jefferson with George Washington. And if Jefferson becomes smaller on close examination, Washington becomes larger. And he's also classically inspiring. He gets his classics not from reading Cicero in the original, but Seneca in translation. He reads Seneca's letters, and he's particularly moved by Seneca on time. And Seneca says, time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it what fools these mortals be. The Shakespeare quotation comes from Seneca. And this creates in Washington a lifelong obsession with time, with clocks and schedules, and is he using his time well, and how I use my time, and diaries, and eating, and exercising, and writing every day at the same time. And a Herculean is an appropriate word, effort to master his temper. He has a strong temper, and is always in danger of losing it. Ron Chernow, in his great biography, which Give Yourself a Treat and Read his Washington, thinks it may have come from his mom, who's always nagging him and telling him to, eat his broccoli or make something of himself. So in order to avoid lashing out at his mother, he develops this granite imperturbability, and he's almost never seen to lose his temper in public, twice. Once on the battlefield when his orders are disobeyed, and once when he goes to the Senate and they disrespect him, and he says, this disturbs the whole purpose of my being here, and he storms out. He's quite attentive to matters of respect. Washington's greatest moment is in 1784 in Newburgh. The troops are about to rebel because they haven't been paid. Congress won't give them back pay, and mutiny is in the air. Washington has read to the troops his favorite play, Addison's Cato, praising the consolations of mild philosophy, and then he mounts a wooden platform called the Temple of Virtue, which has been specially constructed for the occasion. And he pleads to the troops for patience and temperance, the classical virtues, and basically says, just please wait a little longer and I'll ensure that Congress pays you. And he's reading a speech, and he puts on his reading glasses, and he says, forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind. And the soldiers weep. They've never seen him confess weakness before. And it's in that moment of controlled, self-possessed weakness that Washington has never seen greater, because it is self-mastery. It's the source of his greatness. And that is why Washington is viewed by all as the greatest man of his time. It's because of the simple, self-mastered force of his presence that the Constitution survives. It wouldn't have passed if he hadn't shown up. It was mostly that he just showed up that people were able to create a strong presidency because they knew he would be the first president. He didn't say much at the convention at all, except to simply signify his approval of the proceedings by his calm presence, and that is his gift to America. At the end of his presidency, he issued his warning against factions and feared that the Republic might be rent over passion rather than reason, and that's what I want to talk about tomorrow, about how Washington's warnings about how faction could bring down the American Republic the same way it brought down the Greek and Roman republics has lessons for today. I want to end with a word about one of the heroes of the book, who is John Quincy Adams. If I had to pick a single exemplar of the classical virtues, it's hard to think of anyone better than John Quincy. Mostly because he had John and Abigail Adams as parents. And I have to share that I thought that having a Jewish mom sometimes was a little challenging. It turns out that having a Puritan mom is even harder, because Abigail is constantly on his case. Subjugate your passions, work harder, don't squander your talents, ensure that your rational emotions are being subjugated to your reason. And as a result, he's constantly beating himself up for just making a hash of it and for squandering his life. And there's this moment, he's like 35 years old, he's just turned down a US Supreme Court appointment, and he's minister to St. Petersburg, and he writes in his riveting diary, which must be the greatest diary ever written by an American president, I'm 35 years old, I haven't accomplished anything, I'm just frittering away all my opportunities, I'm spending too much time with the theater, I'm drinking too much, and I'm growing fat. He says, if only I had a little self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery. He set a very high bar for himself. But then here's the thing, he actually finds in himself a power that he didn't know that he had before, when he has two great personal crises. In 1828, he loses his bid for re-election as president, and then the following year, his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. He can't deal with the pressure, first of the name, George Washington Adams, which Adams thought might have been too much to impose on anyone to begin with. And then his father is also always, exhorting him to be perfect, and he has a series of letters from a Christian father to his son, which are inspiring, but that would be a lot to deal with. It's be perfect, and here are the virtues, and Adams himself is a close reader of the Bible. And it's important to note that he gets it as much from the Bible as from the classical sources. And the pressure is too much for his son, and George Washington Adams descends into alcoholism and jumps off a steamship. And Adams is crushed. He doesn't know if he can find the fortitude to continue. So what does he do? He spends a year rereading Cicero, and in particular the Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book. And he exhorts from this Latin motto that becomes his personal creed, I plant for the benefit of future generations, not to necessarily see the fruits in my lifetime. And he writes his sonnets, and based on his reading of Cicero and the Bible, he transmits himself into the greatest white abolitionist of his time. And based on his own close Bible reading, he finds a verse where Jesus promises freedom to the captives. And John Quincy Adams concludes that this shows that Jesus meant to prophesy the end of slavery. And it's that close reading that resolves him to introduce a constitutional amendment to end slavery, to denounce the gag rule on the floor of Congress, which forbade the reading of abolitionist petitions, when he's nevertheless silenced for trying to read the petitions. He memorably exclaims, "Am I gagged? Am I gagged?" And then he votes against the Mexican War. He's serving in Congress after his presidency, and then he has a stroke at the end of his life. He's carried to a couch on the floor of Congress, and his last words are, "I am composed." And he gets this from Cicero. Remember that Jefferson passage I read at the beginning? The composed man who's achieved neither undue exuberance or despondence. He is the happy, virtuous, and wise man. And Adams has spent his entire life preparing for the virtuous death, like Cicero himself, who, when overcome by the assassins dispatched by the emperor, who finally turned against him, calmly sets out his head for the blade, exemplifying the self-possession in death as well as life that defines the virtuous life. And John Quincy himself exemplifies the same virtues. It's incredibly inspiring. And he got it from his Bible reading and his deep classical reading. He's the first Boylston professor of rhetoric at Harvard. He writes a book on rhetoric and how to use the reason to subjugate the passions that Jefferson offers to John Adams as the homespun gift to solidify their reconciliation that Rush brings about. And Adams just is closer to the Roman ideal than any other American, although Dickinson also comes close, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. So that's the great John Quincy Adams, and I do want to end by saying that there's a big takeaway for me from this project, in addition to the excitement of discovering these beautiful books and the classics, which I hadn't had the privilege before. And those of you who are classic majors in this great department are so fortunate to be learning this in college. I wish I had that wisdom, and I so admire your good choice in learning about how to lead a good life by studying the wisdom of the ages. For me, the takeaway from the project is getting back into the habit of deep reading, because I've gotten out of the habit of deep reading. I read in college, I read in law school. Later, I would read for deadlines or for some immediate thing I had to write, but not for its own sake, because I'm addicted to these screens, like everyone else. And the takeaway of this incredible experience of, just, you can tell how exciting it was just to be reading again, is I now have a rule that when I wake up, and I'm not saying that I catch the sunrise every morning. I don't want to be a virtue monger and claim that I think I could follow that Jefferson schedule every day. But I do have a rule. I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've read. Mm-hmm. And I do read on here because it just blows my mind that all the books of the world are on this device. It's incredible. What a world we live in. And when I was a kid, I was really young. I went with my mom to the Library of Congress in D.C. to the Thomas Jefferson Building. It's my favorite building in all of D.C. It has these beautiful pay-ins to reading everywhere. The authors and the legislators of the world, and the fountain of wisdom flows through books, and gilded portraits of the gods and goddesses. And I was full of wonder as a very young kid at the thought that all the books in the world were in that beautiful building, and now they're on our phones. It is marvelous. Not since the Library of Alexandria, which Adams thought, if it could be reconstructed, would show the consonants of the wisdom of the East and the West. It's all here now. All I need is the self-discipline to swipe left to the Kindle and not right to email, because I do read online. And it does take discipline every morning because I'm an addict. But it's also a rule, and I found, like Franklin and all those people, that habits are helpful. So I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've done my reading. And it's just great. You just learn so much. I finished another book on how the Hamilton-Jefferson battle defined all of American history, and I'm so eager to share that. And you learn something new every day. And today I just learned from this amazing new biography by Jane Calvert on John Dickinson, which I hadn't read. I learned all about John Dickinson, and I want to tell you about him tomorrow. But we're constantly hearing that our kids are not reading today, and we all know that we adults are not reading either. And it is extraordinarily stretching and edifying and meaningful and exciting to be living in a world where we can read and grow and learn every day, and that's exactly what I'm here as an evangelist for the transformative power of the humanities, of classical learning, and of deep reading. Thank you so much.
Professor Rosen has agreed to answer some questions, so I think, let's take some questions from the audience. I'll let you.
Absolutely.
Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I'm Sophie, by the way. I also am Jewish, and I feel like it's a really big part of my personal identity, especially, there's so few of us in the world, and I was just wondering how your Jewish identity has informed the way that you study American politics and history.
What a wonderful question. You're absolutely right. The Jewish tradition of learning and reading and self-mastery and high moral values inspired another one of my great heroes, Louis Brandeis. And he really thought that just that Jewish tradition of learning and morality was so crucially important, and also turns out to have been inspired by the Greeks. And Brandeis' favorite book was The Greek Commonwealth by Alfred Zimmer, which he thought showed that 5th century Athens represented the apotheosis of civilization, the perfect citizen in a perfect state where individuals could achieve self-mastery in their personal and political lives. And Brandeis used 5th century Athens as a model for the foundation of the state of Israel, which he was more responsible for than any other American. It was Brandeis who convinced Woodrow Wilson to recognize the existence of the state of Israel when the British offered it after World War I. And Brandeis came to see in Israel the possibility of achieving a self-governing democratic agrarian republic where individuals tilling their farms could achieve self-mastery and communal well-being. It was a secular, democratic, and agrarian state was his vision of Israel. Of course, things haven't turned out as he hoped in all respects, and he may have understated the power of nationalism. But for Brandeis, it was urgently important that the Jewish people have the ability to form a majority in their own state, just as every other nation or nationality and religion and race has for its own state. And he thought not only was Israel prophesied and promised to the Jewish people in the Bible, but that it was also a matter of right, and therefore when the world decided to recognize the Jewish authority over Palestine after World War I, Brandeis was at the heart of raising money for Israel, and his motto was men and money and organize, and he did more than anyone else to fund the state of Israel. I am inspired in these anxious times by Brandeis's devotion to Israel and his insistence on self-mastery and reading and high moral values, and those are just some of the ways that I'm inspired. Thank you for asking.
Is there a role for righteous indignation among the virtues?
Great question. I was really struck that the Yale Happiness course, which was written up in the New York Times, the big takeaway that the professor told the students was, go get angry. That's not classical advice. Classical advice would be the opposite of that. That anger is an unproductive emotion, and simply getting angry is not effective and is not productive. And in fact, it's calm self-mastery that will gird you for the fight, as I paraphrased Seneca in that sonnet, and would be a much more effective way of achieving social change. Now, righteous indignation, if it's controlled indignation, might indeed be appropriate, and all of the authorities, including the Jewish ones, insist that criticism and denunciation can be appropriate if it is deserved and considered, but it can't be uncontrolled, and certainly simple hatred, it cannot be justified. Hate is a completely unproductive emotion, and to the degree that hate is the basis of partisanship, it's also not effective. I think there's more to say, and I know in particular from the Jewish tradition, that there are all sorts of gradations about when righteous, how to be righteous, because the goal is always to live rightly, and how to temper the indignation. It's also true that courage is a crucial classical virtue, and many thought it was the most important, certainly resisting the importunations of the crowd and not seeking simple popularity, not mimicking forms of outrage in order to express your identity, but instead being willing to endure the slings and arrows of the crowd and unpopularity is crucial. And Dickinson, it turns out, is another great example for this, because he voted against the Declaration after having been the penman of the Revolution and denounced the British taxation and their attempt to justify and distinguish between internal and external taxation as unconstitutional. He votes against the Declaration because he thinks that it's not prudent, and he doesn't favor violent revolution. He still wants to seek a political solution, and he knows that this will make him incredibly unpopular and scorned, but he says his virtue requires it because his conscience requires it, and for him conscience is everything, and he's willing to take the indignation and the slings as a result. So I'm just moving around your question because I think there's a more precise answer to exactly when righteous indignation is allowed, but my sense strongly is that in all of these cases, uncontrolled hatred is both ineffective and completely to be desired. The main vices are anger, jealousy, fear, and hate. So to the degree that they inform the indignation, then that's not helpful. But righteous indignation is the opposite of simple hate or malice, owning the libs or owning the conservatives, and might, as long as it's self-mastered, occasionally be appropriate.
Yeah, thanks very much for reminding us of, I think you made a really compelling case for reintroducing Seneca and Cicero into our daily lives. I wonder if you might speak a little bit about how, the stuff that happened in the 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and the reduction, the rolling back of the canon, happened for some maybe valuable reasons that, and maybe I'm wondering if you think the founders could have done a little bit more if they'd read a little bit more of their Phaedrus and Plato, and maybe Bible, and were aware that total self-mastery isn't the only thing that we have to focus on. We also have to not lose our eye on beauty, for example.
Absolutely, here. Well, as you know, of course, they read Phaedrus and Plato as well as Cicero and the Stoics, and they were so broadly read, and they had the whole range of aesthetic and other tastes. They certainly weren't uniform in their reading in any way. And Jefferson has a huge section of novels in his list. And he's so inspiring and clear on the transformative power of the humanities to teach us how to live. And he loves Clarissa and Tristram Shandy and the male version of Clarissa, which is this grand gent, who's the virtuous man who's self-possessed. And he basically says when we see exemplars of how to live in literature, we can try to live up to them ourselves. And Aaron Burr is also a great reader of novels and thought if you read more Lawrence Stern, including the passage where he says that killing a single fly was a sin against the harmonies of the universe, he might not have shot Hamilton. That's how important Aaron Burr thought the humanities were. The thing is, this generation, they were just readers. They read voraciously. You don't have to just read moral philosophy. Look at Jefferson's list, and he wasn't leaving anything off it, as far as I can say. It's just, but it's very important, especially in this setting. It's so wonderful that you've convened this group to talk about the value of the humanities in teaching us how to live. This is a time when we've lost faith in so many institutions, and the fact that you are a pillar of light in unapologetically saying that the humanities can teach us how to live by showing us the best that has been known and thought, as Matthew Arnold said, is both unfashionable and self-evidently true. I had a marvelous teacher in college called Walter Jackson Bate. He was the great biographer of Samuel Johnson and John Keats. Check out his incredible biographies if you want a treat. And he also taught us Johnsonian prose, balance and antithesis. The greatest flights of the human imagination are not from pleasure to pleasure, but from hope to hope. The pleasures of sudden wonder are soon exhausted, and the mind can only repose in the stability of truth. I can still have it in my head, and it's just that you hear the musical balance of those sentences, and for all of them, the prose and the aesthetic pleasure of it mirrored the substance. And Bate, he's got a great collection of essays called Criticism of Major Text with introductions to each of the great critical traditions, including the classical ones. And they're just unmatched. You just check them out. And it's in each era, this not only a defense or an apology, but a case, a credo about why you gotta read this stuff to learn how to live. How can we learn how to live and be our best self unless we can see how people throughout history have been their best self and struggled with the exact same emotions and impulses that all of us struggle with and tried at their best to live up to them. Because emulation is so important, and being inspired is so important. Look, it's completely nuts that I spent a year doing this in COVID. Who would have thought this? And I think I was literally thought, wow, Jefferson did this, why I should be able to do this too. And then you read about Adams or Phyllis Wheatley, and it's great to see in the book people are resonating to it, and you just want to be like them. And they show us that we're capable of more than we ever imagined. We had no sense of how much we can actually achieve if we put our mind to it. And that's what the value of humanities is. You kind of introduced this question of why it fell out of the curriculum in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and there are certainly some valid reasons. One was that the Supreme Court said that you can't teach religion in schools, which was a good decision. But that was overinterpreted by some schools to mean you can't have any texts that have any religious context at all, which is not what the case law says, and led to an over-censoring of some of the basic classics of civilization. There's also, I don't have a firm sense of why exactly pop culture shifted in the 60s and 70s. People have all sorts of explanations. David Brooks blames the post-structuralism and the loss of focus on individual achievement. George Will blames the Romantic movement and thinks it was all, I don't know, Hegel's fault or something. This seems a little remote to me. But whatever the cause was, there's no question that once TV and pop culture began exalting feeling good rather than being good, and you do you, and let it all hang out, then all of these virtues just seem fusty and antiquarian, and we just not only forgot, I didn't even know that happiness was self-mastery. It's not intuitive that moderation is self-mastery, which is happiness, which is virtue. And that's why, for most of human history, people have this hammered into them at every stage, not just through the classics, but through the Bible and through the novels and just through all of popular culture. You have to call it that because it was the culture in which all of them were raised. So I do think we've lost something. The solution is not, we all have our own ideas. It's not that people have to read the classics at any particular point, although I certainly learned a lot from it. I think you're very lucky if you're studying it in college. But I think we do have to read. There's no doubt about the fact that there's no substitute for deep reading, broadly, voraciously, constantly, daily, with discipline. And that is a great way to be happy.
I think
We should go. We should invite people to tomorrow.
Yeah, so we have another talk tomorrow. If you have a question that you want to ask, you can come tomorrow and ask it then, but I think we've worked them hard enough.
Yes.